Welcome back to Kafka Internal's Crashcasts. I'm your host, Sheila, and today we're wrapping up our chapter on basic operations with a deep dive into Kafka's command line tools. Joining me as always is our Kafka expert, Victor. Hey Victor, ready to get our hands dirty with some CLI action?
Absolutely, Sheila. I'm excited to show our listeners how powerful these tools can be. They're like the Swiss Army knife for Kafka administrators and developers.
Ooh, I love that analogy. Before we jump in, let's start with a quiz for our listeners. Here's the question. In a Kafka cluster, you notice that messages aren't being consumed as expected. Which command line tool would you likely use to investigate this issue?
That's a great question, Sheila. It really gets to the heart of how these tools can help in real-world scenarios. I can think of a couple of tools that might be useful here, but I won't spoil the answer. Listeners, keep this question in mind as we go through our discussion today.
Perfect. Now, before we dive into the specific tools, can you give us a quick overview of what command line tools are in the context of Kafka and why they're important?
Sure thing, Sheila. Kafka command line tools are utilities that come bundled with Kafka and allow us to interact with a Kafka cluster directly from the terminal or command prompt. They're crucial for tasks like managing topics, troubleshooting issues, and monitoring the cluster's health. These tools are especially important for automation and scripting in production environments.
That makes sense. So, let's start with the basics. What's the most fundamental Kafka command line tool that every Kafka user should know?
Great question. The most basic and essential tool is called Kafka Topics. This tool allows you to create, alter, list, and describe topics. For example, to create a new topic, you'd use a command that specifies the topic name, where to connect, how many partitions you want, and how many copies of the data to keep.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. Can you break down what each part of that process does?
Of course, let's break it down. First, you tell the tool you want to create a new topic. Then you give your topic a name. Next, you specify which Kafka broker to connect to. After that, you set the number of partitions for the topic. Finally, you decide how many copies of the data will be maintained across the cluster. Each of these steps is crucial for setting up your topic correctly.
That's really helpful, Victor. Now, moving on to something a bit more complex. What tool would we use if we wanted to inspect the messages in a topic?
For that, we'd use a tool called the Kafka Console Consumer. This allows you to read messages from a Kafka topic. You'd use a command that specifies the topic you want to read from, where to connect, and whether you want to read from the beginning or just new messages.
That seems really useful for debugging. But what if we wanted to publish messages to a topic for testing purposes?
Great question. For that, we'd use the counterpart to the console consumer, the Kafka Console Producer. You'd run a command specifying the topic and where to connect. After that, you can type messages into the console, and each line will be sent as a separate message to the topic.
I can see how these tools would be invaluable for testing and troubleshooting. Are there any tools specifically for monitoring or getting information about consumer groups?
Absolutely. There's a tool called Kafka CLI that's perfect for that. It allows you to list all consumer groups, describe a specific group, or even reset offsets. For example, you can use it to list all consumer groups or to get detailed information about a specific group.
That's fascinating. It seems like these tools cover a wide range of functionalities. Are there any common pitfalls or best practices our listeners should be aware of when using these command line tools?
Great point, Sheila. One common pitfall is forgetting to specify where to connect in newer versions of Kafka. In older versions, many commands connected differently, but this is being phased out. A best practice is to always use these tools with caution in production environments. Some commands can have significant impacts, like deleting topics or resetting consumer group offsets. Also, it's a good idea to create shortcuts or scripts for commonly used commands to reduce the chance of typos and save time.
Those are excellent tips, Victor. Now I think it's time to reveal the answer to our quiz question. The tool we'd likely use to investigate issues with message consumption is... Drumroll, please. Kafka ConsumerGroups. This tool allows us to see the lag for each consumer in a group, which can help identify if messages aren't being consumed as expected.
Exactly right, Sheila. The Kafka Consumer Groups tool is invaluable for this kind of troubleshooting.
Well, that wraps up our discussion on Kafka's command line tools, and with it, our chapter on basic operations. We've covered setting up a Kafka cluster, creating topics, producing and consuming messages, and now using these essential command line tools. Victor, any final thoughts on this chapter?
It's been a great journey through the basics, Sheila. We've laid a solid foundation for understanding Kafka operations. These command line tools we discussed today tie everything together, giving us the ability to interact with and manage our Kafka cluster effectively. Remember, practice makes perfect with these tools.
Couldn't agree more, Victor. Next up in our series, we'll be moving into Level 2, Jedi Knight, where we'll dive deeper into the Kafka ecosystem. We'll be exploring Kafka Connect, Kafka Streams, and the Schema Registry. It's going to be exciting. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe and leave us a rating. Your support helps us reach more Kafka enthusiasts. Until next time, may the streams be with you.